On June 11, 2025, the Middle East awoke to the thunder of warplanes and explosions. The night sky was torn apart by the roar of engines and the flash of distant fire, as families huddled in their homes, uncertain of what the morning would bring. In cities across the region, fear and confusion spread as sirens wailed, and the first reports of attacks filtered in. The long-feared conflict between Iran and Israel had erupted into open warfare. Years of tension, threats, and shadowy skirmishes had finally boiled over, igniting a crisis that threatened to engulf the entire region. Newsrooms scrambled to keep up as headlines flashed across screens worldwide, confirming what many had dreaded for years. Israeli jets struck deep inside Iran, targeting the heart of its nuclear program at Natanz and Fordow. The precision and scale of the attacks stunned observers, as military analysts speculated about the extent of the damage and the message being sent to Tehran. These sites, once symbols of ambition and anxiety, were now smoldering ruins. The world watched in disbelief as satellite images revealed the devastation, and questions mounted about the future of Iran's nuclear ambitions. In Israel, relief mingled with dread. Retaliation was inevitable. Streets buzzed with anxious conversations as families gathered around televisions, bracing for what might come next. The sense of victory was tempered by the knowledge that the conflict was far from over. In Iran, rage and vows of revenge swept the nation, broadcast on every screen. Leaders promised swift retribution, and crowds filled the streets, their anger echoing through the capital and beyond. The call for unity and resistance grew louder with every passing hour. The world watched in horror as oil prices soared and the specter of regional war loomed. Markets trembled, and governments convened emergency meetings, fearing the conflict could spiral out of control and disrupt the global economy. The fragile balance of the Middle East had been shattered in a single morning. Streets that once bustled with life now lay deserted, as uncertainty and fear gripped millions. Emergency services raced to respond, but the scale of the crisis was only beginning to unfold. The question was no longer if war would come, but how far it would spread. As the world held its breath, the fate of an entire region, and perhaps the world, hung in the balance. Decades ago, Iran and Israel were unlikely allies bound by Cold War pragmatism. The 1979 Islamic Revolution changed everything, turning Iran into Israel's most implacable foe. Diplomatic ties vanished overnight, replaced by bitter enmity and proxy conflict. Iran became the patron of groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, fueling a shadow war on Israel's borders. For Israel, Iran was no longer a distant concern but a powerful, ideologically driven adversary. The old partnership was erased, replaced by a rivalry that would define the region for generations. The stage was set for inevitable confrontation. For years, Iran and Israel battled in the shadows. Sabotage, assassinations, and cyberattacks replaced open warfare. Israel targeted Iranian nuclear sites and scientists. Iran responded through proxies like Hezbollah and cyber strikes. The digital front became as critical as the physical, with both sides inflicting real damage. Each covert attack deepened the cycle of retaliation, normalizing violence and eroding barriers to open conflict. By 2025, the shadow war could no longer contain the animosity. The pressure for direct confrontation became overwhelming. The clandestine struggle had reached its breaking point. Israel's greatest fear is a nuclear-armed Iran, a threat seen as existential, not just to its security, but to its very survival. For decades, Israeli leaders have viewed the possibility of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons as a nightmare scenario, one that could tip the balance of power in the Middle East and embolden Israel's most determined adversary. The specter of a nuclear Iran haunts Israeli defense planners, fueling a sense of urgency and anxiety that shapes every major policy decision. The collapse of the 2015 nuclear deal, which once offered hope of containing Iran's ambitions, and Iran's accelerating enrichment program pushed Israel to the edge. Each new report of advanced centrifuges or secret facilities only deepened the sense of crisis. Israeli officials watched as diplomatic efforts faltered, and Iran's nuclear program advanced with alarming speed. Intelligence agencies warned that the window to act was rapidly closing. Iran was nearing the threshold of nuclear capability. Every satellite image, every intercepted communication seemed to confirm that time was running out. The pressure on Israeli decision-makers mounted with each passing day. Diplomacy seemed futile, and Israeli leaders felt increasingly isolated in their resolve. International partners urged restraint, but in Jerusalem, the mood was grim. The sense of being alone, of bearing the burden of preventing a nuclear Iran, weighed heavily on the government and the public alike. The June 11th airstrikes were a desperate gamble to halt Iran's progress and send a clear, unmistakable message: Israel would never allow a nuclear Iran, no matter the cost. The operation was meticulously planned, but the risks were enormous. Israeli pilots flew into danger knowing the stakes could not be higher. The attack risked igniting a regional war, but Israeli leaders saw no alternative. The possibility of retaliation from Iran or its allies loomed large, threatening to engulf the region in conflict. Yet for Israel, the alternative, doing nothing, was unthinkable. For them, the cost of inaction was simply too high. Israeli families braced for the unknown, watching events unfold with a mix of fear and determination. The nation stood united, resolute in the face of an uncertain future. The red line had been crossed and Israel had made its choice. Whatever the consequences, it would not stand by as the threat grew ever closer. The world reacted with shock and division. In Washington, the US scrambled to support Israel while fearing escalation. European leaders condemned the strike, warning it destroyed hopes for diplomacy and risked a wider war. Russia and China sided with Iran, denouncing Israel and calling for restraint at the UN. The Security Council was paralyzed by great power rivalry, unable to act. Oil markets panicked, and the threat of a new refugee crisis loomed. The crisis exposed deep global fault lines with the Middle East caught in the crossfire. The world held its breath, uncertain what would come next. Iran vowed swift and crushing retaliation, its leaders standing before the world with defiant resolve. The air was thick with tension as officials declared that any attack on their sovereignty would not go unanswered, fueling fears across the region and beyond. Promising to rebuild and accelerate its nuclear program, Iran signaled a new era of confrontation. Scientists worked around the clock, and construction crews hurried to reinforce key sites, determined to show that setbacks would only strengthen their resolve. The risk of escalation was immense. Missile barrages, proxy attacks, and covert operations loomed on the horizon. Armed groups across the region prepared for conflict, and the world watched anxiously as the threat of a wider war grew ever more real. Even a blockade of the vital Strait of Hormuz could ignite a regional inferno, disrupting global oil supplies and sending shockwaves through international markets. The stakes had never been higher. Diplomats raced to find an off-ramp, holding urgent meetings and back-channel talks in hopes of preventing disaster. Every hour brought new challenges, as world powers struggled to contain the crisis. Many hoped for symbolic retaliation rather than all-out war, seeking a way to satisfy calls for justice without plunging the region into chaos. The pressure on negotiators was immense, as every decision could tip the balance. The anger in Tehran was intense, with crowds filling the streets and demanding action. The sense of national pride and outrage was palpable, echoing through every corner of the city. Pressure for a powerful response was mounting, as military leaders and government officials weighed their options. The world braced for what might come next. The Middle East stood at a crossroads, its future uncertain, its people anxious. Tension zones flared across the map, each one a potential flashpoint. One path led to devastating war, with cities reduced to rubble and families torn apart by violence. The scars of conflict would last for generations. The other path offered a fragile, uncertain peace, one that would require compromise, patience, and immense courage from all sides. Restraint and diplomacy were the only hopes to avoid catastrophe. The world's eyes were fixed on the region, praying that cooler heads would prevail. The fate of millions now hung in the balance, as ordinary people waited anxiously for news, hoping for peace, but fearing the worst.